Hey, welcome back to the channel. Thank you everyone for joining. In today's video, we're going to talk about the California housing market. A lot of people have been saying how the market's going to be crashing, but I'm going to provide some data to show what's actually happening right now regarding home prices, home sales, price reductions, and much, much more. I don't want to waste your time. Let's go ahead and dive into the video. This is from the California Association of Realtors. I'm going to share a high-level overview about what's happening, not share all these slides. Also going to provide some analysis regarding home prices compared to pre-COVID levels to see if numbers are in line with what we should expect, or are we seeing a sharper correction than in previous years. Anyways, let's talk about sales. And by the way, this video is only looking at existing single family houses. In other words, excluding brand new home construction, and of course, excluding multifamily units as well. So home sales this January, this was just announced a couple of days ago, is down by 1.9% year over year. So sales are down by about 2% compared to January of 2024. Meanwhile, the statewide median sale price is at $838,000. That is up 6.3% year over year. And again, stay tuned here very soon. I'm going to share how these numbers compare to years past. The unsold inventory index, this is pretty high, about a 5-year high right now, 4.1 months. That's an increase of 28.1% year over year. We'll talk about more about that in a little bit. Days in the market increased by 9.4%. So in January, for the houses that did sell, they sold in about 35 days. All right, let's talk about sales, and then we'll talk about home prices. So it says here, sales decreased sharply to the lowest level in over 1 year, down by 1.9% year over year, and down by 10% month over month compared to December. And by the way, this decrease down by 1.9% is actually the first year over year decrease since May of 2024. Whereas before that, we saw gains year over year for quite some time. Now, something you guys should be aware of is that sales vary quite a bit depending on the price segment. So houses that did sell in January for less than $750,000 decrease year over year. And of course, we're seeing big decreases in the much more affordable range because there's a lack of houses for sale due to the increase in prices. And of course, our median sold price is over $800,000. So of course, it makes sense we have a big decrease in the lower range there. But this is a common scenario we've been seeing for quite some time. Sales over $2 million rose by 29%. I can't remember the last time that this segment was the biggest increase year over year. So sales over $2 million surged by 29% from January 24. In the range of $1 million to just under $2 million, it increased by 10%. So now looking at January 25, 31% of all home sales were for over $1 million. That's a pretty big increase compared to the 27% share we saw 1 year ago. Pretty wild, right? Nearly 1/3 of all home sales were over $1 million here in California. And how this compares to the national average, the national average is around $400,000. And of course, here in California, we're basically double that. Definitely pay to live here. So looking at kind of a look into the future regarding closed home sales, pending home sales posted the biggest decrease in 14 months, down by 6.4%. So this is likely to cause closed home sales to be at relatively low levels in January and February once they release these numbers. On top of that, we're seeing a fairly big increase of inventory numbers. So because of this decrease in pending sales and also this sharp rise of inventory, that's going to put downward pressure on the growth rate of home prices. Now, speaking of home prices, I have a lot to share regarding this. So again, we're up by 6.3% year over year and down 2.6% compared to December. Sounds like a lot, right? Actually looked at the historical averages going back to the year of 2010. It's actually more normal to have a bigger decrease in January compared to December. All right, let's have a look at my nerdy analysis because of course I'm a real estate data nerd, right? So at 838,850, that was back in January. That's actually the lowest levels since January of 2024. Something to keep in mind, like I mentioned right there, these figures are not seasonally adjusted. And because of this, we tend to see a lull in January and February each and every year, more or less a trough of the year. And then, of course, the high point is the spring home buying season. So it's not abnormal to say that this is the lowest level since January last year. So for example, back in January 2024, we're at 789,000, the lowest level for that year. Then looking at pre-COVID levels, let's look at January 2020. This is right before COVID. 575,000, the low point of the year as well. Then in February of 2019, we're at 534,000, also the lowest point of the year back then. And one more, let's look at January 2018. It's actually a little bit higher compared to February. February's was the lowest reading that year as well. So in any case, at 838,000 this January, entirely normal that this is basically a 12-month low. Now take a look at this though, because this kind of blow your mind. At least it did for me. I was really surprised by this. So the gain in prices based on the median sold price here in California, it rose by 6.3% compared to January of 2024. Again, this marks the 19th consecutive month in which home prices increase year over year, and the highest gain since July of 2024. Back then, we saw a gain of 6.5%. However, though, this gain of 6.3% in January is actually lower than the long-term average. The long-run average is a gain of 8.3%, going all the way back until January of 2010. Now let's talk about the month-to-month change. December to January this year, it decreased by 2.6%. Again, sounds like a big decrease, but it's actually much less than what we should expect during this time of year. So for example, the average January, this is the average December to January change going all the way back until January of 2010 is a decrease down by 5%. Whereas this January, it's basically half the decline, a decrease of 2.6%. In addition, it's not nearly as bad as the 3.7% decrease we saw back in January of 2024 as well. In addition to that, I'm just kind of hammering this point. I don't want to see people saying, oh my gosh, it's down by 2.6%. And therefore, we have to multiply this by 12, right? We have to multiply this by 12. And therefore, this means that home prices are going to decrease by 31% this year if this trend continues, right? It's complete BS. This is not seasonally adjusted. Entirely normal to see prices decline in January. And in fact, I'm supporting this with data, go figure, right? Anyways, I get all triggered about this. So 2.6% in January this year. Looking at January of 2020, that was when home buyers got their offers accepted in December before COVID, when COVID hit really in January, February of 2020. Back then, we saw a big decrease down by 6.5% compared to 2.6% decrease this year. Also looking at January of 2019, it decreased by 3.7. Then we saw a decrease down by 3.4% in January of 2018. I'll say this again though, we should expect to see the growth rate in home prices kind of easing up a bit due to the fact that pending home sales are decreasing, which means that it's going to take longer for houses to sell. On top of that, we're seeing a big increase of inventory numbers or the amount of houses for sale. That's going to limit this growth rate of home prices. Now, having said that, we're still up by about 46% compared to January of 2020. Right before COVID, we're up by about 50%, up nearly 50%, which is pretty wild. All right, so going back to this slideshow, this is from the California Association of Realtors, by the way, and just sharing my own analysis of their data. And this, by the way, was a data pull I took from their website. Everything else is my own analysis, right? I'm a nerd. What can I say? Anyways, let's go back to this here as well. This is the sale price to final list price ratio, decreased to lowest level since February of 2023. That ratio was at 98.6%, which means on average, out of all the houses that did sell in January in California, they sold for 1.4 percentage points less than their asking price. So for example, if the asking price is $800,000, on average, it would have sold for $789,000. This, of course, is much different compared to the spring home buying season of 21 and 22, when homes on average were selling about 4% over asking. Now they're selling for less than the asking price. So good news for home buyers out there. Here's what we also know as well. Only 30% of the houses that did sell sold for over the seller's asking price. This means, of course, that 70% sold at or below the seller's asking price. According to CAR, this ratio decreased to a 23-month low. I'm going to say this is not seasonally adjusted, and this ratio tends to be at a trough or the low point of the year in January, right? So January 2019, that ratio was at about 20%. January 2017, around 23%. I can't see 2016's numbers, but you can see here in January 19, it was a low point of the year. Then again, January 2020, also low point as well. That ratio back then was just under 30%. So even though the ratio right now is a little bit lower compared to 1 year ago at 33%, it's still higher compared to pre-COVID levels. And again, what we should expect to see in the months to come is for this ratio to increase as more home buyers enter the market, making it a little bit more competitive, and therefore we tend to see more houses selling over asking price compared to the trough of December and January each and every year. All right, let's change gears slightly here because there's some big news here. Look at this. Inventory jumped to the highest level since mid-2020. If you exclude the onset of COVID, though, this is basically a 6-year high. The month supply at 4.1 months, which again is going to limit home price growth in the coming months. However, having said that, we're not going to see a sharp correction like we saw in 2008 because look at that. The month supply was over 16 months in 08 and also in 07. Now we're at 4.1 months. So we're basically in line with pre-COVID levels. If you exclude the onset of COVID, which is this big increase right here, if you exclude that, the levels right now at 4.1 months is more or less in line with January of 2019. Back then, the month supply was around 4.6 months. Let's have a look at this as well. This is inventory levels going all the way back until January of 2018. I love how they shared this, but this is pretty wild here as well. We saw a sharp increase in the amount of houses for sale this January. This is this right here, which is unusual because we kind of see a flattened inventory levels compared to December, more or less plateauing or a very small increase. So for example, back in January of 2019, which is right here, we saw a small increase compared to December. Then January 2020, again, a very small increase compared to the previous month. Whereas this January, a big increase compared to December. And in fact, going back for the past several years, we haven't seen anything like this since at least January of 2019. In fact, inventory increased by 46.1%. We haven't seen inventory growth this high since 2022. So if you're looking to buy a house in California, it's great to see they have more options for sale, right? You have more options. Houses are taking longer to sell, which is great news for home buyers right now. If you are a home seller, though, be very, very careful to what you ask for your house, because if you ask too much for your house is going to sit in the market, and that's why we're seeing a big increase in the number of price reductions as well. So be very cognizant of that as well. Now, speaking of that, take a look at this, because new listings, a measure of homeowners selling their houses or getting their houses on the market, that had the biggest monthly gain in at least the last 7 years. So new listings spiked by 29.9%. We haven't seen a sharp increase of that in quite some time. So right now there's 16,748 houses that got listed for sale in January, a big increase compared to January 24, back then just under 13,000. However, I will say that even though we have more inventory, we have 30% more new listings, the measure of new listings is still lagging behind pre-COVID levels. So for example, back in January of 2019, there was nearly 23,000 new listings that hit the market, far below the 16,748 we saw this January. This, my friends, is one of the reasons why we still have a lack of houses for sale compared to pre-COVID levels here in California. Yet another sign that the housing market in California is kind of slowing down as well is that days in the market went from 32 days to 35 days, which means it's taken about only 3 days longer to sell a house. But at 35 days, that's the highest level in nearly 2 years. This is all contributing to the rise of inventory levels as we're seeing fewer contracts being signed, fewer pending home sales, and of course, houses are taking a little bit longer to sell as well. Now, speaking of that, like I mentioned, the share price reductions has been increasing. It's up by 31.4%. I don't really like this graph because I can't see previous January's numbers. So instead, let's look at altosresearch.com in California. And it's actually a little bit more updated than CER, for example. So for the week ended February 1st, according to Altos Research, the share price drops is at 26.1%, higher than last year this time at 23%, but at 26% right now, a little bit lower than the nearly 27% we saw at the same time frame in 2023. However, at 26 right now, we're still higher compared to 22, 21, and 2020. If you guys are curious how this compares to the national average, then I'm glad you asked. The share price drops nationally is at 33%, quite a bit lower than California. Also at 33, this is higher than last year, higher than 23, and well above the past several years before that. With that said, if you guys are interested in buying or selling a house in the greater Sacramento area or the San Francisco Bay Area, then we'd love to help you guys. Please email me at jason@meetjasonwalter.com. We'd love to be assistants to you, and we love helping people who find me through YouTube, believe it or not, who want to buy or sell houses in our area. Also, if you're looking to buy a house anywhere across the country, then you can check out my website, which is realestateteamfinder.com. I can connect you with a great real estate agent in your neck of the woods. With that said, please like and subscribe. I appreciate you guys so much. Have an amazing day, and we'll see you in the next video.